Imagine being arrested in broad daylight, not for breaking the law, but simply for reading a book in the park. Imagine being treated like a criminal, handcuffed, humiliated, by officers who never once questioned their actions, only to see those same officers again, not as a victim, but as the judge presiding over their fate. This isn't just a story about injustice. It's a story about strength, about what happens when a woman refuses to stay silent, when she turns pain into purpose, and when the system that tried to break her must finally answer to her. This is the story of Danielle Rivers, and you won't forget it. Ashbridge Park in Oregon was alive with spring energy. Children's laughter bounced off tree trunks, dogs chased frisbees, and joggers weaved between picnic blankets. On a weathered wooden bench by the lake, Danielle Rivers turned the page of a worn novel. A former civil rights attorney turned judicial nominee, Danielle rarely had time for herself. That day, she allowed the breeze, the bird song, and the smell of fresh-cut grass to lull her into rare tranquility. Then came the screech of tires. A police cruiser swerved abruptly into the curb nearby. Two white officers stepped out with practiced authority. Their eyes scanned the area, then locked onto Danielle, the only black woman alone on a bench. One officer adjusted his belt and approached. "Ma'am, can we have a word?" he asked, tone sharp and skeptical. Danielle closed her book calmly. "Of course." The second officer stepped forward. "We got a call about suspicious activity in the park. Mind telling us what you're doing here?" Danielle raised an eyebrow. "I'm reading a book, in a public park." But the air shifted. Their postures hardened. She recognized the change. Not procedural concern, but quiet hostility. And this, she knew, was only the beginning. "May we see some identification?" the first officer asked, voice cool but edged. Danielle's pulse quickened beneath her composed exterior. "I'm sorry, could you explain the reason for the request?" "It's routine," the second officer replied, though his tone was anything but neutral. A few people nearby slowed their pace, ears tuning in. A jogger stopped to stretch within earshot. Danielle sighed and reached into her bag, pulling out her wallet and handing over her driver's license. The first officer read the card aloud with deliberate condescension. "Danielle Rivers. And what's your business here, Miss Rivers?" "I live in Ashbridge," she answered evenly. "I came to enjoy the park." "We'll see," he muttered. The officers didn't walk away. Instead, their questions grew increasingly absurd. "Do you always carry a book that thick? Are you here alone or waiting for someone?" One officer rested his hand near his holster. Danielle kept her voice steady. "I won't answer any more questions unless I'm told what I'm being accused of." But that moment, that demand for clarity, flipped a switch. "Don't make this harder than it needs to be," one snapped, stepping closer. Danielle's lawyer instincts fired off alarms. This wasn't about a report. This was a test, one she hadn't consented to. Without warning, the officer grabbed her wrist. "You're resisting," he announced loudly, performatively, though Danielle hadn't moved an inch. "What are you doing?" she gasped, stunned. The crowd's murmur turned to outcry. A teenage girl began recording with her phone. An older man shouted, "That's not right!" "Stop resisting!" the second officer yelled louder, as if declaring it made it true. Danielle's hands were twisted behind her, cold steel locking around her wrists. Her breath caught in her throat as the metal bit into her skin. Shame, disbelief, and fury collided inside her. She hadn't resisted. She hadn't even stood. And yet here she was, paraded like a threat, for reading in a public space. As she was led toward the cruiser, Danielle turned her head and caught the eye of the girl recording. In that fleeting moment, a silent message passed between them. "Don't look away. Document everything." The car door slammed shut. Danielle sat motionless in the back seat, wrists aching. The book she'd brought was left behind on the bench, a symbol of serenity now discarded, just like the illusion of safety she once believed in. She had defended justice for years. Now she was on the wrong side of it. The ride to the precinct was suffocating. The only sound was the low crackle of the police radio. Danielle stared out the window, her reflection flickering against the glass, fractured by flashing lights. She wasn't a stranger to police stations, but never like this. At intake, she was treated not as a professional, not as a human being, but as a suspect. Her belongings were taken. She was fingerprinted, photographed, and led to a holding cell with flickering fluorescent lights and a metal bench that felt like it had never known warmth. "Enjoy your stay," one officer said smugly as he shut the door. Danielle sat, hands clenched tightly in her lap, and replayed the entire scene. How had a peaceful moment in the park spiraled into this? The answer was as bitter as it was obvious. Prejudice wrapped in a badge. For hours no one spoke to her. Time blurred. Her stomach growled. Her back ached. Finally, a young officer approached. "Ms. Rivers, you're being charged with resisting arrest and obstruction." "On what grounds?" she demanded. "You can discuss that in court," he said without meeting her eyes. She knew then, this wasn't about law. It was about power, and power had just declared war. She was released on bail just before midnight. The air outside the precinct was crisp, stinging her cheeks like pins. Waiting at the curb was Alicia Gomez, her closest friend and legal colleague. "Danielle!" Alicia rushed to hug her, then pulled back, searching her eyes. "Are you okay?" Danielle nodded, though her body trembled. "I'm fine." "You don't look fine," Alicia said gently. They drove in silence, the headlights slicing through the dark. Back at Danielle's apartment, neither spoke as she changed clothes and sat at the kitchen table. Then finally she said it. "I'm not letting this go." Alicia looked up. "What are you thinking?" "I'm thinking I've spent my life fighting for others. This time it's my turn." Danielle grabbed a notepad. The fire in her chest hadn't faded. It had focused. She began outlining a civil rights lawsuit. Every word she wrote was a refusal to be silent, to be dismissed, to let them rewrite the truth. Outside, the city slept, but inside that small apartment, a storm was gathering, and Danielle Rivers was preparing for war. By morning, the video was everywhere. The teenage girl's clip, shaky but clear, showed Danielle calmly responding before being handcuffed without cause. No resistance, no aggression, just dignity met with force. Within 24 hours, hashtags spread. Justice for Danielle, Konekchasher, reading while black, Machasram Ashbridge, injustice. Local news picked up the story, then national commentators, celebrities retweeted, civil rights attorneys and community leaders started calling. But Danielle didn't chase the spotlight. She shut off her notifications, ignored interview requests, and focused instead on strategy. Alicia, meanwhile, watched the storm grow. "People want to hear from you," she said, placing a mug of coffee beside her. Danielle didn't look up from her laptop. "I'm not here to entertain. I'm here to hold them accountable." She had already outlined the lawsuit. Now she was building the case, requesting body cam footage, compiling records of complaints against the same officers, and connecting with victims who had been too afraid to speak up until now. At her core, Danielle understood something critical. Visibility meant nothing without follow-through. Her battle wasn't about viral sympathy. It was about systematic change. And now the world was watching. Danielle's law firm was divided. Some partners were proud, quietly admiring her resolve. Others were nervous. "We're known for our discretion," one of the senior partners warned. "Public lawsuits like this, they draw heat." Danielle sat tall at the conference table, her fingers interlocked. Discretion is important, but silence in the face of injustice isn't discretion, it's complicity. A few eyebrows rose. One woman nodded. Alicia stood by her, arms crossed. "If we lose clients over this, maybe they weren't the kind of clients we wanted anyway." By the end of the meeting, Danielle made her stance clear. She would not back down. Not for PR, not for comfort, not even for her career. Outside the firm, something unexpected happened. Other women, black, brown, indigenous, began sharing their stories, tagging Danielle, thanking her. A quiet sisterhood rose around her. Some called her Judge Rivers already, even though her nomination was still pending. But the most surprising call came from her attorney, Terrence Lee. "Danielle, you've been assigned to preside over a new internal misconduct case next month." "So?" "It involves two officers." He hesitated. "The same two who arrested you." Danielle's hand froze midair. Poetic justice or a moral minefield? The courtroom buzzed with low murmurs. no cameras, no reporters, just people, many curious, some quietly supportive. Danielle adjusted her robe behind the judge's chamber door. Her hands trembled, not with fear, but with gravity. When the door opened and she stepped up to the bench, the room fell completely silent. At the defendant's table sat officers Reed and Marlowe, uniformed, composed, until they looked up. Reed's eyes widened, his jaw slackening. Marlowe shifted in his seat, throat bobbing with a hard swallow. It was her, the woman they had mocked, handcuffed, dragged off like a criminal, now wearing the robe of judgment. Danielle sat, calm, regal. She scanned the room, then spoke. "This court is now in session. Please be seated." The prosecutor began the opening statement, a case of excessive force against a young black motorist. Not Danielle's case, not her incident, but something almost identical. As the lawyer spoke, Danielle's focus didn't waver, but deep inside the weight pressed heavy. Could she truly be impartial? Could she deliver fairness to the very men who denied it to her? She had to, because that, not revenge, was the higher justice she believed in. Testimonies began. First was the victim, Tyler Hammond, a 19-year-old honor student, trembling as he took the stand. "They didn't even ask questions," he said. "I was reaching for my license when they slammed me against the car." "Did you resist?" Number I said, "Yes, sir," and did everything they asked. It didn't matter. Danielle scribbled notes but felt each word like a punch. Different setting, same abuse. Next came the body cam footage, grainy but damning. No escalation, just impatience and dominance. Then the officers were called. Reed fumbled through his explanation, blaming adrenaline, miscommunication, ambiguous gestures, but his voice shook. When the prosecutor asked, "Would you have done anything differently?" he hesitated. I guess I should have waited." Danielle looked up then. Their eyes locked for a brief moment. No anger, just piercing clarity. Marlowe followed, equally defensive, blaming protocol, blaming fear. Neither blamed themselves. As the court recessed, Reed and Marlowe lingered near the exit, whispering in panic. "How is she the judge?" Reed muttered. "She shouldn't even be here," Marlowe snapped. "She's not the problem," their lawyer cut in. "Your actions are." But they weren't listening, because for the first time, they weren't in control. Day 2. The gallery was even more crowded. Rumors had spread. People knew who was on the bench and who she was judging. Danielle walked in calmly, her black robe flowing like a silent flag. She took her seat, tapped her gavel, and resumed the hearing. The prosecutor delivered a scathing closing statement. These officers didn't make a mistake. They made a decision to treat a young man as a threat based solely on skin color. Then the defense responded, citing stress, unclear body language, compliance confusion. Their words sounded hollow. Danielle kept her face neutral, but inside the echoes were loud. But the most surprising call came from her attorney, Terrence Lee. "Danielle, you've been assigned to preside over a new internal misconduct case next month." "So?" "It involves 2 officers." He hesitated. "The same 2 who arrested you." Danielle's hand froze midair. Poetic justice or a moral minefield? The courtroom buzzed with low murmurs. No cameras, no reporters, just people. Many curious, some quietly supportive. Danielle adjusted her robe behind the judge's chamber door. Her hands trembled. Not with fear, but with gravity. When the door opened and she stepped up to the bench, the room fell completely silent. At the defendant's table sat officers Reed and Marlowe, uniformed, composed, until they looked up. Reed's eyes widened, his jaw slackening. Marlowe shifted in his seat, throat bobbing with a hard swallow. It was her, the woman they had mocked, handcuffed, dragged off like a criminal, now wearing the robe of judgment. Danielle sat, calm, regal. She scanned the room, then spoke. "This court is now in session. Please be seated." The prosecutor began the opening statement, a case of excessive force against a young black motorist. Not Danielle's case, not her incident, but something almost identical. As the lawyer spoke, Danielle's focus didn't waver, But deep inside, the weight pressed heavy. Could she truly be impartial? Could she deliver fairness to the very men who denied it to her? She had to, because that, not revenge, was the higher justice she believed in. Testimonies began. First was the victim, Tyler Hammond, a 19-year-old honor student, trembling as he took the stand. They didn't even ask questions, he said. I was reaching for my license when they slammed me against the car. Did you resist? Number I said, yes, sir, and did everything they asked. It didn't matter. Danielle scribbled notes but felt each word like a punch. Different setting, same abuse. Next came the body cam footage, grainy but damning. No escalation, just impatience and dominance. Then the officers were called. Reed fumbled through his explanation, blaming adrenaline, miscommunication, ambiguous gestures. But his voice shook. When the prosecutor asked, would you have done anything differently? He hesitated. I guess I should have waited. Danielle looked up then. Their eyes locked for a brief moment. No anger, just piercing clarity. Marlowe followed, equally defensive. Blaming protocol, blaming fear. Neither blamed themselves. As the court recessed, Reed and Marlowe lingered near the exit, whispering in panic. How is she the judge? Reed muttered. She shouldn't even be here, Marlowe snapped. She's not the problem, their lawyer cut in. Your actions are. But they weren't listening, because for the first time, they weren't in control. Day 2. The gallery was even more crowded. Rumors had spread. People knew who was on the bench and who she was judging. Danielle walked in calmly, her black robe flowing like a silent flag. She took her seat, tapped her gavel, and resumed the hearing. The prosecutor delivered a scathing closing statement. These officers didn't make a mistake. They made a decision to treat a young man as a threat based solely on skin color. Then the defense responded, citing stress, unclear body language, compliance confusion. Their words sounded hollow. Danielle kept her face neutral, but inside the echoes were loud. She thought of herself, handcuffed, degraded, of Tyler, terrified and bruised, of countless names who never got a courtroom. As she dismissed the court for deliberation, Reed stood slowly. Before he left, he turned to her. Your Honor, I'm sorry. It wasn't loud, it wasn't enough. But Danielle nodded. Not in forgiveness, but in recognition. Justice was not just about punishment, it was about acknowledgement. And with that, she turned to her notes. The verdict would come soon, and the world would be watching again. The days leading to the verdict were heavy with anticipation. News had leaked. Blog posts emerged, speculating how a black woman judge would rule in a case involving the same officers who once humiliated her. But Danielle stayed silent. She didn't check her phone. She didn't read the news. She worked. Behind closed doors, she reviewed every testimony, every clip, every line of the officer's prior records. Her job was not to satisfy public sentiment. Her job was to uphold the law. Still, she couldn't silence the ache in her chest as she replayed Tyler's voice. They decided I was guilty before I opened my mouth. The courtroom was full when she stepped back onto the bench. The air was thick. Even the lawyers looked tense. Danielle adjusted the microphone and cleared her throat. The role of law enforcement, she began, is to protect the community with integrity and fairness. When that power is abused, it corrodes public trust and inflicts harm far beyond the immediate moment. She paused. And in this case, that trust was broken. Every eye was on her as she prepared to deliver the ruling. Danielle's voice was calm, measured, but each word landed with weight. The evidence presented has demonstrated that officers Reed and Marlowe exercised unnecessary force. Their actions violated department protocols and reflected a troubling pattern of bias. She glanced at them. Both men sat motionless, pale and stunned. For these reasons, this court recommends the following: immediate suspension without pay, mandatory participation in racial bias and de-escalation training, and formal documentation of disciplinary action on their permanent records. Gasps echoed across the room, not because it was too harsh, but because it was real. Danielle closed the file gently. This court is adjourned. She rose. The officers remained seated, as if their legs couldn't move. Then slowly, they stood. Marlowe walked out stiffly, head down. But Reed paused. He turned back, looked at Danielle with hollow eyes. "I didn't realize," he muttered. Danielle didn't answer. Apology was a beginning, not an end. As the room emptied, reporters swarmed outside. Protesters clapped. But Danielle walked quietly to her chambers, shoulders heavy with something more profound than triumph. Justice had been done, but the wound that led to it was still raw. Later that evening, Danielle attended a community town hall at the local library. The room was packed. Activists, mothers, teachers, even off-duty officers. They didn't come to congratulate her. They came to speak. One young man stood. "I was stopped 6 times last year. Never charged, never explained, just stopped." A middle-aged woman with tear-lined eyes whispered, "My son's afraid to walk home at night. He's only 12. Danielle sat and listened, not as a judge, but as one of them. When she finally stood to speak, her voice was soft. "Today was a small victory, but accountability isn't enough. We need change." A hush settled. Policies, oversight, education, and more than anything, the courage to speak when silence feels easier. An elderly woman shuffled to the front afterward. She reached out and clutched Danielle's hand. "Thank you, baby," she said, voice trembling. "You didn't just hold them accountable. You gave us hope." Danielle smiled gently, tears pooling but not falling. That night, she didn't go home feeling powerful. She felt responsible. Because change wasn't a ruling, it was a ripple, and now it was moving. In the weeks that followed, Ashbridge changed. Community leaders proposed new review boards for complaints against law enforcement. Schools invited Danielle to speak to young people about justice and identity. Even the city council requested her input on reform policy. But not everyone was pleased. Anonymous emails came in, hate letters, subtle threats about her nomination to the federal bench. "You're too loud. You're too emotional. You're biased." Danielle forwarded them to her assistant without blinking. If integrity made her unfit for higher office, then maybe the system wasn't worth climbing. Still, late at night, those voices haunted her. "Am I doing too much?" she asked Alicia one evening. "No," Alicia said. "You're doing exactly what they hoped you wouldn't. Surviving." Danielle looked out the window. Below, a group of high school students were holding signs in the park. Reform. Respect. Remember. They weren't just inspired. They were organizing. The ripple had become a wave, and it was only beginning. One quiet Friday morning, there was a knock at Danielle's office door. A man stood there fidgeting with his cap. "Can I help you?" she asked. "I'm Officer Mark Dempsey," he said. "I used to work with Reed and Marlowe." Danielle tensed. I wanted to say thank you," he added quickly. "I watched the hearing, and it opened my eyes." She studied him. "I'm not saying all cops are bad," he continued, "but too many of us look the other way. That's on us. I didn't step in when I could have. I should have." His voice cracked. "I'm trying to do better. I hope more of us will." Danielle didn't smile, but she nodded. "Then start today." He left, shoulders heavy, but maybe lighter than before. As Danielle returned to her desk, she whispered to herself, "That's what change looks like. One truth at a time." A week later, Danielle was invited to speak at a local high school. She almost declined. Court filings were piling up, and she was emotionally spent. But something told her to go. The auditorium was full. Teens in hoodies, sneakers tapping restlessly, murmurs echoing. When Danielle took the stage, silence followed. She didn't give a lecture. She told a story of a woman who did everything right and was still treated like a threat, of a system that too often punished people for existing. Then from the back row, a small voice rose. "Ms. Rivers," a freshman boy asked, "do you ever get scared?" Danielle paused, then smiled. "Every time I speak out, every time I walk into a courtroom, every time I choose truth over comfort, yes, I get scared." He nodded. "Then why keep doing it?" She looked at the boy, and every young face in that room. "Because the fear doesn't mean I'm weak. It means what I'm doing matters." The room erupted in applause. That moment, honest, simple, reminded her. Her courage gave others permission to find theirs. Late one night, as Danielle sifted through legal briefs, a handwritten envelope slid under her office door. No return address. Inside was a single page, slanted cursive. The ink smudged slightly, as if written in a rush or with regret. I was there that day, the park. I worked dispatch. We never got a real call about suspicious activity. They lied. Danielle's fingers tightened around the page. Her breath caught. There had been no call. She'd suspected it. But to see it confirmed, in writing, shook something loose. There was no signature, no name, just truth from someone afraid to own it. She tucked the note into a secure file, not yet sure what she'd do with it. She knew the system would bury a whistleblower, but it also validated everything she'd felt. What was dismissed as a misunderstanding had been a setup. That night she sat by her window, watching the lights of the city blink softly in the distance. They thought they'd broken her in that park. They didn't realize they'd set her fire ablaze. One morning, Danielle received a call from the governor's office. "We'd like to meet," the aide said, "in person." She arrived to find the governor himself waiting. "Judge Rivers," he greeted warmly, "you've sparked more change in 6 months than most of us in 6 years." She sat cautiously. "I appreciate that. But why am I here?" He smiled. "We'd like to fast-track your appointment to the state's Court of Appeals." Danielle blinked. "That's unexpected. You've proven your integrity. Your voice is needed higher up." It was the opportunity of a lifetime. Prestige, influence, a seat where she could write decisions that shape generations. But Danielle didn't say yes immediately. That night, she paced her apartment, staring at the city's glow. Was she ready for more power and the isolation that came with it? Alicia called. "Whatever you decide," she said, "just remember your strength isn't in the title. It's in who you lift along the way." Danielle smiled faintly. Her decision was forming, not just for herself, but for the voices still waiting to be heard. Weeks later, Danielle hosted a quiet dinner. No press, no speeches, just a gathering of people who had stood beside her through it all. Tyler came too, the young man from the trial. He looked different now, straight shoulders, clearer eyes. "I got a scholarship," he said, beaming, "to study criminal justice." Danielle blinked back surprise and pride. "I want to help fix it," he added, "from the inside." "You sure?" she asked. "Because of you," he said. "I saw what justice should look like. I want to be that for someone else." They hugged, a tight, long, wordless embrace. It was moments like these, not verdicts or promotions, that reminded Danielle why she fought. Each act of courage plants seeds. And here, one had taken root. Eventually, Danielle accepted the appellate position, not for prestige, not for headlines, but because the higher the bench, the louder the echo of justice. On her last day in the district court, she walked alone into the empty courtroom where everything had changed. The same one where she'd ruled against the officers who'd once cuffed her. She stood behind the bench and whispered softly, "Thank you." Not to the system, not to the robes, but to the voice inside her that had refused to stay silent. As she stepped outside, a group of children from a local middle school waved and shouted, "Judge Rivers!" She laughed, waved back. This fight wasn't over, but it was no longer hers alone. On Danielle's first day in her new courtroom, she found a note on her desk, typed this time. "Thank you for proving that dignity wins. Some of us are watching, some of us are learning." No name, again, but she smiled. Because the whisper that had slid under her door weeks ago, it was now a roar in the hearts of many. Ashbridge began implementing body cam audits, community oversight boards, and required bias training. What had begun as a wrongful arrest turned into a catalyst for reform. Danielle didn't need monuments. She had momentum. Months later, Danielle returned to the park. The same bench, the same lake. This time, no officers pulled up, no suspicious glances, just a quiet breeze and pages turning in the sunlight. She sat reading, not as a judge seeking refuge, but as a woman reclaiming space. Nearby, a mother whispered to her daughter, "That's her. That's Judge Rivers." The little girl waved. Danielle waved back. And just like that, The park wasn't a place of pain anymore. It was a reminder. She belonged. Danielle's story spread to other cities. Other victims stepped forward. Other attorneys fought harder. Other judges ruled braver. What was once isolated became collective. What was once feared became fuel. And Danielle's name became synonymous not with the injustice she faced, but the courage she showed. Not all change could be measured in laws passed. Some change lived in how people walked taller, how they demanded answers, and how they refused to be silenced again. Danielle published a memoir, Judged Before I Spoke. It wasn't a bestseller, but it didn't need to be. It found its way into classrooms, courtrooms, and community centers, into book clubs and barber shops, into the hands of future lawyers, future judges, future changemakers. She gave every dollar of proceeds to a legal aid fund for wrongfully arrested citizens. Because her story wasn't just hers. It was a mirror for the nation and a challenge to be better. Years later, Danielle sat on a panel beside federal judges, law professors, and reform advocates. Someone asked her, "What's the most important lesson you've learned from all this?" She smiled. That silence serves power, but courage creates progress. And no matter how loud fear gets, dignity must speak louder. As the room applauded, Danielle looked into the crowd and saw Tyler in the back, in a suit, now a lawyer himself. Their eyes met, and in that moment, without words, the torch passed. Because justice isn't a destination, it's a decision, made over and over again. This story reminds us that justice is not just found in courtrooms, it's forged in courage. When dignity is met with discrimination, it takes strength to stand, speak, and fight back. Danielle Rivers didn't seek revenge. She sought accountability. And in doing so, she showed the world that real change begins when we turn our silence into action, our pain into purpose, and our stories into movements. Because sometimes the most powerful verdict comes from those who were once silenced.